I'm loving it.
Awesome.
Okay, so we're here to talk a little bit about the history of Runner and how the team works today from an engineering standpoint, and get a little bit more context on why it's only in core and all of those details from your perspective, Elliot. And then we'll also give the opportunity for Hayana to ask some questions on how you've worked with UX in the past, given that you don't have any front end engineers. But I know that you have a question on this great breaking thing with Travis CI no longer offering free minutes for free users.
Yeah.
Would love to hear where you're going with that, and then we can.
Okay, so you want me to keep going with this?
Yeah.
So in that thread, there's a lot of people talking about like moving off of Travis CI to like, oh, here's why I went to Circle, or here's why I went to, I don't know, one of the other ones. No one mentions here's why I went to GitLab CI, which I think makes sense because we don't position ourselves as that. Like we don't try and bring people in to our world unless they enter through the source control. I mean, we do a little bit, I think, but like it's so like no one would even consider doing it.
I think you're bringing up a really interesting point, especially in light of the fact that we are trying to contain free user costs. So offering like free CI minutes and how we're looking at what free CI minutes means to core users in GitLab has changed. So it's an interesting paradigm that we're also struggling with. But when we think about the customer journey, we show like this sequential path of they are a landing, like the customer buys us for source code, and then we convert them to CI, convert them to CD, convert them to secure, convert them to monitoring.
Yeah, it's like you start at the left and kind of like you add on stages sequentially, right?
You totally. And we should be marketing more of landing with CI because of how lovable we are for the engineer, for the developer experience. In next year, marketing is investing in a bunch of campaigns to drive first new logo, new business, and expansion plans for CI. So we will start to see like sales enablement and market enablement around landing with CI.
Cool.
So I think that you are totally calling the ball there, and you're like, yep, that's definitely where we need to go. I think we've acknowledged that, and now we feel like we can make that transition as an organization. But my job is looking to see if we're ready to take on like enterprises in CI that way. If we have the right maturity, the right level of features, the right nuances to help the SCM customers adopt CI seamlessly. And in preliminary research, we have a lot of great features around the developer experience, but for enterprises who are looking to do a change management, like to uproot Jenkins or uproot Travis CI, there's a heavy lift for them in order to rewrite their pipelines in GitLab. So understanding those blockers and being proactive so that when we do start landing with CI, that we can easily support them in their migration to GitLab.
Yeah, it's a good call. I mean, like it's definitely a different migration for like a bigger enterprise situation. And probably a lot of those comments that I was looking at were probably from smaller cohorts, because it's usually even framed that way. Like, here's why I moved to X CI instead of Travis, and not like, here's why my massive Fortune 500 company moved to this, right? So that's a really good distinction.
Totally.
But it's cool to see that there is a plan to kind of address that or take that on, and so I will keep an eye out for that in the new year.
Perfect. Okay, so let's go to the first topic around history of Runner, getting some more background on how the team's been formed, what it's been working on, to get better context on like where we've been and how the team is formed. And then Hayana, feel free to ask questions as we go.
Yeah, so definitely ask questions as we go, because I mean, the history is it's super broad and super generic, and so I feel like there's some specific threads you guys are interested in. So just help me steer towards that if I'm not even close. So CI doesn't exist without the runner. Like it's what runs the CI/CD jobs, and so the runners exist as long as CI and CD has. It's changed. It's been a little bit different over that time, but um, fundamentally it was there. It used to be called, I think it used to be called the GitLab CI multi-runner, but clearly engineers made that name, and then that got fixed. And then it used to also be released, I think it was released on the same time frame, but it had its own version numbering. And so like GitLab 7, for example, might have come out, and then like the runner version 1 came out. I'm just making those numbers up as an example, but at some point they just jumped ahead to match the version numbers. So, I always get this wrong, but I think this month we're releasing 13.7, and so that's for GitLab and for GitLab Run. The releases are lockstep now. Maybe like the most concrete history of like a team working on it can just like be tied to like the time I've been around. So when I joined here about 2.5 years ago, we had 5 people total backend engineers working on GitLab CI/CD, which was one team at the time. So that includes anything we do in release right now, anything we do in CI and testing right now, and the runner. But what was strange and a bit awkward is that the runner has always been a very different skill set. It's a completely different language that most engineers at GitLab don't work in. It's got its own challenges and own concerns, and so it made a really weird kind of to kind of balance resources and allocate resources. So over time, as we split things out, we broke that out into its own team, and we have grown that as because like I think every time we split something off, we realized just how much we wanted to accomplish that was like needed at the runner level, because the runner is the abstraction layer for the CI/CD infrastructure, right? And so if you're running in a unique, or if you have like a particular picture of what you want your CI/CD infrastructure to look like, it's the runner that has to handle it, and it's not the other stages. The other stages should almost be completely unaware of it. So if you're doing virtual machines in GCP or managed Kubernetes in DigitalOcean, like the CI features shouldn't know or care. There's a little bit of a weird asterisk there with like some stuff around containerization, but for the most part, that's the case. And that's only handled by the runner.
Can we talk a little bit about why it's only in core and not divided by tiers? Because I think that's something that's kind of interesting, since it is a separate entity within GitLab.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna have to kind of think out loud as I go here on this, because it's always been that way, and it's never been something that anyone's kind of aggressively questioned. Part of the architecture of it supports that really well, because when the runner takes, so the way it works kind of behind the scenes is that each runner is always is every few seconds or however long it is polling GitLab and saying, hey, do you have any jobs for me? Do you have any jobs for me? Do you have any jobs for me? The reason it's polling and not pushing mostly is because a bit of complexity. If it was the other way around, imagine how many like push notifications GitLab.com would be sending out to all these different runners. But then also it means that to install the runner, you don't have to fiddle around with any firewall rules, because it's making a request out, so you don't have to like do any firewall configuration. So it's a bit of a cleaner install there. So if you do need to make any firewall changes, it's the one you already had to make on GitLab, the server part anyway. So it requests, do you have any jobs for me? And all it kind of is on the GitLab Rails side, it's like, oh, this runner is asking for jobs. I know it has these tags associated with it, like maybe it's like Windows Docker tag or something like that. And so, do I have any jobs that match that? Do I have any jobs that like can fit with the way that this runner's been configured for me? The runner itself, we typically refer to as being really dumb. Like it doesn't have a database. It doesn't know how to talk to a database. It doesn't have any concept of a user or anything like that. And so when things like pricing tiers come into play, like there's just no way for the runner to know what tier you're in. Like as a user pushing a job, we just don't know. We can't tell. That could be handled. If we ever wanted to introduce features like that, that could be handled on the GitLab Rails side. So it's not gonna, oh, you're a whatever type of user, you're not gonna, I can't assign this job to a runner, or this runner isn't for you. It's at a higher price tier, this features or something like that. But there's no concept of the runner being able to distinguish that itself. And so the types of features you would want to split up on have to be the sort of things you can sort or use tagging with, right? So like there's just some things where it wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't work really cleanly to do that. Again, as for why it was chosen to go that way from the start, I'm not entirely sure. What it does really open up is that bringing your own runners is a very powerful thing. You can kind of do everything literally instead of bring your own runners if you've got the infrastructure set up. Yeah. Is there a particular reason you're asking about this? Is there just kind of because it is a bit of a weird quirk?
Yeah, I think if we ever wanted to layer on, tier value for high availability runners or something like super niche around the enterprise experience, we would today just build that in core, even though it wouldn't necessarily be relevant for all users. And it would, even if we defaulted it to like on, people might turn it off because they don't necessarily need that sort of
that complexity that comes with. So there was a proposal Darren wrote up for a new type of runner called a protected runner. I think you wrote this up last week. And this is a kind of an interesting example because it's literally, you don't want certain users to be able to run jobs on a certain runner. And so it's like, if this runner has access to your like AWS deploy keys, you only want a certain set of users to be able to do that. The current setup is like, there's some workarounds you can kind of like hack into GitLab and like make it happen, but it's not like a clean, obvious, pleasant user experience. And it's probably not very auditable because it's like, here's this like duct tape solution to prove that like we're secure in this way, and it's not really the most user-friendly sort of thing. But all that logic would have to be handled on the GitLab server side. A bit of a language quirk. We usually internally in our team just refer to like the GitLab server as just GitLab, and then the runner is just runner. So if I say that and not GitLab server, that's what I mean, because it's just simpler sometimes. But on the outside, it is confusing. Yeah. The other thing that would be weird or would be challenging with doing pricing tiers is I don't know if I have to think about this a little bit more, but just because the runner's making this request and you're giving this API response to it, it feels like it would be easy enough to like mock that and kind of like add some API response in there that's giving access to some of these feature levels. I'd have to think a bit more about that and the practicality of that, but because of this, because we'd be like kind of layering on this tiering notion on top, it feels like it would be a little not the cleanest solution, but I need to think a bit more about that challenge.
Yeah, and I think we're in this constant push and pull at GitLab where personally we want to be always contributing the most to open source community and building in value for our core users, but then we're getting this tension from the revenue side of the house. Like, I need features to sell, I need to support this enterprise use case because we are a choice provider for enterprises trying to do a number of things inside of their applications. So we're missing an opportunity, but we're also sort of preventing ourselves to support more unique use cases of these enterprises operating at scale, like centrally managed runners, for example, and creating a different way of supporting these use cases for runners when they're not on .com, I suppose, because sounds more like a less than shared runner experience. It's more like they're managing their own fleet of runners.
Yeah, I think yeah, no, I totally see that, and I totally get that on the like the revenue generation side.
And it's not something we need to solve here. I think this call was like was just to present like outside looking in with a fresh eye on Runner and on CI/CD in my new role, and like for the benefit of Hyana too. Like, why don't we have a tiering structure? And we ran into this with GitLab Pages too, right? And there's lots of opportunities for us to add complex configuration options for the enterprise for GitLab Pages. And there was a bunch of interest where people would pay for certain features in GitLab Pages. And that's ultimately the question that I end up asking when I'm interviewing customers, like, well, what features would make you pay more for GitLab, right? And that's the opportunity with tier value and Ultimate, is by providing enriched options across our platform. So for our Ultimate customers who are paying quite a bit for their seat or license, right? But it's interesting to hear of that limitation in Runner, but it might be like completely fine. We just
well, I think like I said, there are some opportunities to do it. Like nothing's popping into my mind, and like we have to make sure that the sort of feature we go down that path with is the right sort of thing. Yeah. For instance, something that's only really of interest to enterprise customers is the fact that you can run the runner on Z-Linux on a mainframe. Like most people, like I looked into it, mainframes are expensive still. Like most people aren't doing this. Like that's really only an enterprise feature. But it isn't the sort of feature that really lends itself well to being tier related, because really it's just cross compiling, and the language, the reason we aren't written in Ruby, the reason we're in Go, is because we have this ability to cross compile. And so anyone could look, it would be incredibly trivial for anyone to kind of like undermine that pricing structure, and it would, I think, feel really cheap and like dishonest of GitLab to charge for that kind of feature, because anyone could literally create a downstream pipeline from us and just cross compile it, and it would be like a 3-line GitLab CI YAML, and then there'd be like this unofficial publishing of this thing that we're trying to charge money for. Like it's not, there's not a lot of like intellectual knowledge to doing it, even though it's totally targeted at the enterprise customer. Whereas things more like management, things like where you're interacting with a runner from the Rails app. So like the protected runner idea is maybe a good idea for something like that. But also like, this is probably what Jana's interested in, is like some of these like features around like how you manage the runners that are connected either to your group, your project, or your instance, and maybe enabling more power in there. And so I'll give you a great example that there's a lot of engineering challenges behind trying to do this, but just as a thought experiment, every 30 days, if people are keeping up, they go and update their GitLab install. And for every runner, they have to re-go and update that. But what if from the GitLab Rails app, once you update it, it comes with the binaries for all the different runner distributions. And then it can tell you, hey, this runner you're connected to is out of date. Do you want to update it? And so from a management point of view, if you choose to go this path, which probably the most like largest scale enterprise users wouldn't want to do, they'd want to have their own infrastructure of codes sort of system for reproducibility. But if you're kind of like in that middle tier where like management's big enough to be a pain, but not big enough to have a dedicated project to track, something like that could be like quite attractive and quite helpful, and it would save a lot of time. Saving a lot of time, I think, is kind of the key thing what people would pay for in a feature, right? This is really similar to, so I don't know, however many companies ago, I used to work for a company that made video surveillance cameras. And this was really the common pattern in that. So like you'd have these 100 cameras in your casino, and then you'd have the server. And when you updated the server software, it came with new firmware of all the cameras and would just like broadcast that out. And all the cameras would get updated. And it was more important there because to update a camera, you physically have to like get up on a ladder and like do some stuff. It was a huge, huge pain. The same notion, I think, for some groups of customers can be a really attractive feature. And again, because it would save them time and make management easier and keep things like up to date seamlessly and not be worried about like say security patches and things like that, it could be really attractive. And that would, for the most part, need to be handled in a way that is kind of in line with current licensing model, without kind of like breaking the fact that the runner itself isn't licensed.
Yeah, like that's the most practical tier value to add to runner without impacting the architecture of runner as we know it today. Got it. I think this is a beautiful segue into Hyana's point of how have you worked with UX in the past, given that you don't have any front end engineers.
We don't have any.
Painful question.
Yeah, sure. So specifically with runner, because again, like there was a time where like we were kind of more combined and it was like all of Verify was one group. I guess to be frank, it's been a bit clunky, right? Because we have these features that we put into this category of like enterprise management. So it's like being able to do these kind of like broad settings to the way a GitLab instance is talking to its runners. And I think there's been, we had quite a bit of appetite to like work through some of those. And then it's just, we've always been playing this kind of like split situation with like the UX person is working with us, like working with another group. And so it's like not clear like where their priorities are. It's not clear to them, like, are we just giving them busy work? Like it's been like, we've actually kind of had to try and make sure it's explicitly clear. Like, no, this is actually important. We're not just here to like, you're allocated here 25% of the time. We're not just like going up with busy work. I think, frankly, I think some of our UX around the runner is atrocious. Like so I have this one test project that I always use as like a debugging project. And so I've connected hundreds of runners to it. And I never delete them because once I've done the debugging piece, like just my habit, I don't clean it up. There's no way for me to like do any sort of mass tidying up or deleting or management. So I have dozens or hundreds of disconnected, never to be reconnected runners in there. And it is just like a burdensome chore for me to go and tidy that up, and I'm never going to go and do. I know we have users feeling that. Worse, we're actually looking at some features or recommendations that would actually kind of encourage that sort of cruft to build up. And so if we do that, we would probably work in some, use the API bit to clean up for the users if they're going down that path. But I think how they're doing tidying up and how they're doing, again, that like taking a look at like connected instances and being able to like query that and cut and slice that information is pretty rough. And so it is, I think, really bad. We've also been just juggling with like where our priorities are at. It's just there's not enough emphasis or demand, I think, on it. We've seen a bit of change in that in probably the last 6 months with some of these more enterprise management features kind of like getting attention, which is awesome. But yeah, it's been a bit tricky because not only do we not have it almost feels like a parallel kind of priority stream that we're working on these things. And so not only do we not have like the kind of integration with it, but most of the team isn't ever actually working on those features. We don't have a dedicated front end person. The front end person we have working is kind of in the same style, like it's like a shared resource between another team. And so it's always felt a bit like at least a second class citizen.
Yeah. And I think from my perspective, being new to this stage, well, maybe not new to the stage, but definitely like getting deeper into the use cases and understanding the customer problems. I'm starting to see that being like an inhibitor to what we could accomplish with the runner experience, and that we haven't planned the business case opportunity around it because we have this sort of wholesale approach. Since runner is in core, there isn't tier value being invested in. And since there's not tier value being invested in, we don't build the business cases to invest in front end. But in my head, like we need to invest in front end now so we can start getting tier value and then we can fund runner to be a bigger team or a larger team, because as the engine of CI, this is what's going to give us faster builds. This is what's going to solve our enterprise problems as far as building applications more efficiently. And once we start adding in like a little clippy for pipelines, like, hey, you might want to reduce your waste here inside of GitLab, then we need the runner to actually execute that change as fast as possible so that we can keep up with the market, you know? And Clippy was a bad reference, but you know, it's like being a helper to
clear.
pipeline.
I get what you're saying.
Okay. But being like a helper inside of our pipeline, authoring upstream of the runner, we need to go full circle on this. And I'm worried that like if we don't have these management tools inside of the platform at ASAP, that people won't start seeing the return on investment in any of the improvements we're making upstream, because we don't have like clear analytics showing your build times are improving since you're making changes in your pipeline and our runners are super fast. Does that make sense? Like I'm like forecasting some challenges that we
I think
into.
So maybe where, and it's almost like this, like, I don't know, snowball or chicken and egg thing, right? But I think maybe then like what are the things we want to work towards kind of enabling with that path? So like we could heavily improve the UX and front end of this, but to your point, like if that's the end goal, it's noble, but it's not going to generate revenue, right? It would make me a little bit happier every time I go into my project, but I don't think that's what we want to optimize for. And so what's the next, like what's the layer?
I think your happiness is important, Elliot.
I think it's important. I don't think it's what the company should optimize for though. Because if the company optimizes for revenue, I'll get happy as well.
I do think that optimizing for user delight is something we haven't invested in CI as much.
Totally. I love the stuff I've been seeing from the CI or pipeline authoring group, some of the sketches that are coming out. Like that is super exciting on that note.
Even if we optimize in the short term for user delight, we'll see usage dividends pay off in the downstream. So like think of the Slack app as an individual user. The more I use my mobile app, the more productive I am, the benefit comes to my company, the more likely my company is to purchase the enterprise version of Slack for everybody in the Slack team, because Slack is so micro focused on this individual user working with their mobile app, like as a company. So if we optimize for like the user delight of runners and managing the runners or working with runners, even though it doesn't directly correlate to CAC, which is like, you know, the customer cost to acquire, or doesn't talk to the lifetime value of a customer, which is the revenue that we get from a customer, we still start seeing a positive impact in usage, which means our top of funnel is increasing, which means the population by which we can convert to a deal is increasing. So
Right.
even if we aren't optimizing for revenue, we're optimizing for another thing. We start improving the top of funnel access, and then we convert more at the end.
Right.
So it's like, how do we spur that? And if we're not investing in those experiences, then we can't spur it, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm all for like,
Okay.
like you don't have to convince me. We just need to like create some issues and stick to saying that these are priority, even though they're, you know, not immediately revenue generating, and I will support them because I think it's important.
And I'm totally like speaking, you know, out of turn, because obviously like this is Darren's space and he's going to have the most expertise on where time should be spent. This is just like a different perspective on how can we make, you know, runner be a revenue opportunity without tiering it, right?
Sure. And so I guess the other piece on that would be, we're talking mostly about the self-hosted enterprise. The other revenue opportunity then is the so-called shared runners on .com. Right. And I know there's some baggage there because even just calculating if their revenue or their revenue generated, but calculating like how much that brings in is a bit complicated. But with the new tier, with the new types, you know, it's, I think, really open that door, especially with the Windows ones. I guess Mac OS too. But there's definitely some big revenue generation available there. And so one thing we could consider once we move these shared runners out of open beta or closed beta is making them only accessible to at certain tiered levels. Or like you want to do Windows builds on I don't even remember what our tiering levels are, to be honest, right now. Let me just Google this real quick.
On Ultimate.
Yeah, I'm like, did we call it Ultimate and Gold? Like,
Oh yeah, it's gold.
So whatever it is, but like, sure, if it's gold, then saying like, you know, Windows shared runners aren't available at bronze plans. You have to be at silver or higher. The other part of that too is then the cost of them needs to go up, and we need to like, you know, we're familiar with the issue of like figuring out the costing and whatever. And the next layer on that, I would say, is like, even if we keep the operating systems available for Windows and Linux, this doesn't really apply on the Mac OS as much, but like saying like, you can run Mac OS and Windows jobs on any tier as long as you're paying for the minutes. If you want an increased instance size, or if you want a GPU access, like those are only available at these more premium tiers. And there's some research showing that that we're starting to do kind of piecemeal that shows that, and if you think about your build, there's two costs to any CI job: time and instance, like time to actually get the build done, and the money you spent on the instance. There's some evidence showing that with the right configuration of machine, you can save both. So you actually pay less money and your job gets done faster. That's going to be really personal depending on the type of job you're running. So it's not going to be something we can like widely apply because it's not how computers work. But big enough organizations will kind of go through that optimization process themselves. And that's something we could have that little clippy say like, hey, like we recognize that you're doing this kind of job. We've done some analysis on here. We actually think you would save time and money by graduating to this higher capacity tier. You can either bring it yourself or unlock it by like upgrading to like the silver plan or the gold plan or the platinum plan or whatever we call our plans, because it's
Yeah.
like some part of my brain just never remembers
Just
pricing plans, no matter
never
what
knows to
we're
convert them
at.
to. Yeah, I got
Yeah.
it. Hayan, I think you have one more question, and then I think we're at time too. So I'll pass it to you to ask your last question, and then we can go from there.
This is something that I remember Juan talking a lot about, given my very few context in working with TI and Runner. It was really about not just the discoverability of runners within our application, but the understanding that our customers or that the people have of runners when we talk about CI/CD. And I remember Juan had an insight that say something like users not only have issues figuring out what it is, but I'm talking about the UI, right? But once you getting started with CI/CD, Runner is not a first-class citizen, so I have no idea what about the whole potential of it. So I know that we are almost out of time, but
I'm familiar with this, and I remember these conversations, and there's still some kind of ongoing. But the fundamental, like, imagine you're a new user to this ecosystem, and you want to set up CI/CD. And well, first, at any point, do we tell you need a runner, or do you have to kind of like stumble across that yourself? And then the next thing is, well, why do I need a runner, and what is it? Like, why do I need this thing? I don't think we have. I don't know if this. I think this is probably like a bit of a blurry line between like UX and documentation, and so that's why our technical writer was in this has been in these conversations a lot with us. And it's like we don't really set people up to, if I'm a user, if I'm setting this up for the first time, I want to know the bare minimum knowledge to just get this up and running and not a piece more. I don't want to waste more time like going into the nitty gritty details about like theoretical things I might want to do. I just want to get a job running at first. And so we don't really set that up well at the moment, because we don't tell you you need a runner. We don't tell you what a runner needs to be. And then worse, and this is purely within our group, we don't tell you that you also have to pick an executor. And then what the heck is an executor? Do you need an executor and a runner? Like, what are those things? Like, how does that play together? And so we have a bit of a terminology challenge, which unfortunately is a really hard thing to turn around. Like, we can't just like change the terminology, because now we have two sets of terminology that are floating out there in blog posts and documentation. But I think we need more around just like a hand-holding, getting up and started sort of thing. And yeah, so I think most people don't want to care or don't want to know about the runner. It's at first. Once they get comfortable, then they want to explore and see like the different possibilities and configurations. Oh, cool, you can do auto scaling. That's really powerful. You can do different architectures, different clouds. You can do all of that from one runner manager. That's really cool. But at first, I think they just don't want to know. They've already got too much like intellectual burden of like trying to figure out this new world. Like we're just piling it on at that point.
Yeah. You mentioned that this is something that is still ongoing. Is there like any ongoing effort that Darren is working on?
I haven't seen anything about it probably since JJ left, but I think there's some MRs and issues floating around about like just even trying to refine the terminology, because I think even the terminology is consistently used in our own documentation. My big criticism with our current documentation is it's a great reference once you already know what you're looking for. And so you should, if you haven't already, chat with Suzanne, who's our technical writer with our group. She covers, has a really great insight into this, but she kind of explained it to me like our documentation is a reference, but there's no like how-to, there's no guides, and there's rounding down to the nearest percentage point, and there's none. There's a teeny tiny bit of that, but if you're a new user, it is intimidating. I know what I'm looking for, and sometimes I find it intimidating, but it is mostly all there.
I know where some of these issues live, and I know that Juan worked on some recommendations from a scorecard of, I don't know, a year ago. So I'm going to look into it and I'll align with Darren to see what are the low-hanging fruits. Because if this is still open, if it's in the backlog and we can work on it, I think we can
I think what's would be really helpful with that, and maybe with, I guess, all of this, like how we worked with UX in the past topics, is let's like work towards it. Like it feels like we've been kind of just like hitting little things here and there without much of like a consistent like vision or plan to get to. And maybe that's probably a symptom of just kind of the way we have worked with UX in the past. But I think that would be really helpful. Like there's an ocean of things to do. Like let's pick one pain point and let's try and resolve that in a quarter. And let's pick one, the next big pain point and resolve that in a quarter. So whether that's getting started documentation and things like that, or if that's, some of the management UI, because I don't think most of that's really a tremendously big amount of engineering work. I think redesigning it might take a while because I think it deserves a lot of rethought, but.
That's good. Lots of information. I'm going to dive into it next.
Yeah, and like feel free to just ping me and follow up with any of it. Or if you can't find something that I mentioned.
For sure.